July 1908, off the Tunisian coast. These men are sponge divers, but today they're looking for something new. This man, Alfred Merlin, has put them up to it. A young archaeologist following a hunch that could make his reputation, or turn him into a laughingstock, digging at the bottom of the sea. For the divers, danger is ever present. Work in the French Department of Archaeology wasn't supposed to be so risky. If things go wrong, Merlin's future is a dusty office in Paris. If he's right, it's a small revolution. The Mediterranean, the center of the Roman Empire. Plenty of ships never made it to their destination, leaving a giant treasure chamber of unique works of art. Raising sunken cargoes has become a way of understanding long-lost cultures. But just over 100 years ago, no one dreamed it was possible. Diving into history would seem absurd. But one day in May 1907, all that changed. Greek fisherman Yorgos Zordos is cruising off the Tunisian coast, looking for sponges. These men are used to free diving 40 meters to the seafloor. They've just started using bulky and dangerous diving suits that let them stay underwater a lot longer. No one dives for sponges like the Greeks. And here at Mahdia is where they find the best. The new suits give them more time underwater. They rely on their colleagues for a life-giving air supply. This day, they haven't found a single sponge in 3 hours. Instead, one of the divers pulls out a marble head in perfect condition. "200 kilometers away, a French archaeologist is coming to the end of the digging season. This is the site of ancient Carthage, and Alfred Merlin is directing its excavation in France's Tunisian colony. It's Merlin's dream job, uncovering buried cities, clearing away the dust to discover what made ancient civilizations flourish, sifting through the reasons why they declined. His right-hand man is Louis Drapier. Today, Drapier is visibly excited. He has just received a hit from an antique statue. It was found on the seabed off the small port of Mahdia. Apparently, it was surrounded by huge columns of marble. Merlin is electrified. He has a very good idea what this could mean. He can see himself passing on the news to Paris. He has found a sunken city off the Tunisian coast. He even dares to hope that it might be Atlantis. Merlin has never even heard of Medea, but it's clear he has to go there. The plan writes itself. He will mount a scientific survey of the seabed, something no one has ever done before. Merlin cables for money, holding out the lure of Atlantis. At the French National Library, the director of the French Agency for Underwater Archaeology, Michel Luer, examines Alfred Merlin's notes of that first discovery. Merlin dated the first find at about 2,000 years old. Pretty good for a rough estimate.
I wish I'd met Merlin. I'd have loved to have talked to him, because he was there right at the start of underwater archaeology. Merlin couldn't know what we know now. These objects are from a time when there were great ports and trade routes right across the Mediterranean in the 1st and 2nd centuries BC.
Merlin's instincts were spot on. The statue's head was from the most turbulent period of the Roman Republic. Rome's power was expanding fast, establishing cities and colonies all around the Mediterranean. In 146 BC, with final victory over Hannibal's Carthaginians, Rome absorbed all North Africa into the empire. It was the dramatic ruins of Carthage that made Alfred Merlin become an archaeologist. Here at Carthage, Merlin excavates theaters, temples, and villas, the summer houses of the local elite. He immerses himself in the ancient world, identifying more and more with the Roman way of life. Knowing the olive oil he uses is the same as the Romans, that he tastes the same fruit as his ancient forebears. But what if one of those towns had simply disappeared into the sea? Everything would be left as it once was. It becomes his obsession to find out and to find all the remains he can. There's just one thing. Merlin can't dive. The men who can are the Greek sponge divers. It looks like Merlin can't do without them. So Merlin and Drapier set off for the harbor at Medea. At first, the skipper of the diving crew is rather reluctant to talk to an official of the colonial government. In this trade, parting with knowledge usually results in unwelcome interference. But the young archaeologist doesn't seem bent on causing trouble. And anyway, the captain's latest find lies on deck for anyone to see. Merlin and Drapier are in for another surprise. This is something truly astonishing. It's a herma, an antique head that would be attached to a column as a bringer of fertility and luck. And on the side, Merlin finds a signature, Boethos of Chalcedon. If a celebrated Greek sculptor made this, Then how did it end up here? How many people in the Roman province of Africa could afford a priceless piece like this? Merlin urges the skipper to cooperate. He must know what else is down there. Zordos doesn't care about the Romans, but he can see a business opportunity. Alfred Merlin seems to be on the edge of his dreams. Unlike Merlin, Michel Lua has a guaranteed budget from Paris, and that means he has all the kit he needs. His teams have salvaged masses of relics from the seabed, stocked in a warehouse at his Marseille headquarters. Most of their finds are from the Mediterranean. Lua knows that every fragment here can add to our understanding of the ancient world. It's just a question of piecing them together.
A shipwreck is like Pompeii underwater. Every single piece is important. You always have to keep the whole in your mind's eye. A wreck can give us a great deal of information about its cargo, its route, about people's preferences and tastes. And we can learn something about life on board ship, too.
Michel's teams have investigated more than 1,000 ancient wrecks all around the Mediterranean. Most of them merchant ships supplying Rome's everyday needs, but some carried valuable works of art. It's these that interest Lua, because they can give us new insights into the lives of the Roman elite, a passion Lua shares with Alfred Merlin. For Lua, the Mediterranean is the superhighway of the antique world, with just the same risk of traffic accidents.
They knew the rules then. Never go out in bad weather. The Mediterranean is uniquely dangerous. The sea can seem so calm, but it can turn very rough in the blink of an eye. And that's why so many voyages in ancient times ended in disaster.
Looking at the evidence from Medea, Michel still can't be certain where the objects originally came from. But he is sure of one thing. They're not from Atlantis. Back in 1908, Alfred Merlin himself has an alternative theory about the origins of the statues. Africa was a vital source of food, supplying wheat, wine, and oil to faraway Rome. Suppose the rich merchants of Africa did indeed spend some of their money on art. Merlin needs to salvage more objects to test his theory. On Tuesday, the 28th of July, 1908, just over a year after the first finds, Greek fishermen and French archaeologists weigh anchor. Merlin is planning a survey of the seabed. And then something happens that he didn't expect. The fishermen can't find the spot. Merlin's frustration with Captain Zordos rapidly increases. What's he playing at? Then Zordos reveals his secret chart, the location marked with reference to 3 landmarks on shore. Line up the rocks, the fortress, and the windmill on the right bearings. And the place must be directly below. It sounds so easy. It's a classic navigation device. a triangulation. Then they send down a diver and find nothing. The days drag on. Merlin and Rapier are literally out of their element. Somewhere beneath the waves may lie scientific treasures, riches yet unseen. The men are exhausted. Merlin is on the verge of giving up. They know, in theory, what diving involved 100 years ago at France's Professional Diving Institute near Marseille. Michel Lohr has decided to try out an early diving system on himself, to find out what it means in practice to be weighed down and tied to the surface at the same time. When you try to work underwater.
It makes you feel completely helpless. I have to wait for someone to screw on the helmet or put on my boots. It's exactly the opposite of the way I'm used to working. You're completely dependent on other people.
Espalion, down the coast from Marseille. The Scaphandre Museum and its historical diving collection. Michel's diving suit came from here. This is also the place to come for diving stories that end in death. Curator Muriel Pasek believes it took a special kind of man to work on the seabed.
Of course, the skippers chose the fittest men for the job. Most of the divers couldn't turn it down. Most of them were poor. They needed the money to feed their families. They were brave men. In their way, they were heroes.
They were also great storytellers. Divers were popular heroes of magazines and novels. They specialized in encounters with giant sea monsters. Michel learns that this first generation of diving suits had faults that cost hundreds of men their lives.
A helmet diver is not independent. He needs help from the surface. And the diver always has to watch the oxygen levels in his helmet and regulate them himself with a valve. The whole system is much more complex than our equipment today. It was really only for professionals. Diving for pleasure didn't exist.
100 years ago, Captain Zordo's men dived to 70 meters in these suits. Michel would be content with 2 meters. The suit weighs 80 kilos. Every movement takes enormous effort, even underwater. If the air tube gets fouled, Michel's helper up top will only have a few seconds to rescue him. Back in July 1908, this complicated machinery is making the search even more difficult. Time and again, the Greek divers break off and resurface. Merlin can only watch and wait as the men return empty-handed. He worries about the telegrams coming from Paris. He can see nothing but shame and the wreck of a promising career. After every fruitless dive, Melin orders Captain Zourdos to anchor a few meters further on. The men are now descending 10 times a day. The money's running out, and there won't be any more unless Melin comes up with a big find. The worst is, Melin doesn't know whether he can trust Captain Zourdos. Drapier suspects the skipper and his crew of merely leading them astray, that they intend to keep the exact position to themselves, to salvage the finds on their own, and try their luck in the illegal but highly lucrative antiques trade. But then, it's small, but significant. And where there's one piece, there must be more. Melin can now survey the seabed and so invent a brand new discipline. From this small beginning, the discoveries now come thick and fast. Marble reliefs, the statue of a young man, lamps, furniture, vases. Alfred Melin sees the decor of a luxury villa, Greek style and Roman pomp, in the middle of the Mediterranean. But is this evidence of a sunken city or of a shipwreck? Melin needs to find something else. Melin quizzes the divers incessantly. How much is still down there? How big are the objects? Communication is difficult. The divers don't really understand what they are looking for, nor what they have found. Slowly, Melin puts together a sketch of the sea floor. His divers tell him they have seen great stone columns, up to 60 of them. Logically, the remains of a sunken temple. Only one way to find out. The columns must be raised and dragged onto shore. It's madness. These objects weigh tons. There are no rules about how to go about it. Zourdos tries to cut short the attempt, but Melin insists. Then, 40 meters down, a rope breaks, ripping a diver's breathing tube. All the crew can do is drag him up to the boat. Now Captain Zourdos threatens to quit, before one of his men is killed. Alfred Melin faces a stark choice. His future, his career, secrets of the ancient past, against the risk of a man's life. In a harbor near Marseille, Michel Lour is starting his underwater test. The 100-year-old helmet and lead boots turn Michel into a cartoon figure. They make him move like a puppet. Any maneuver takes enormous effort. And he's completely dependent on the crew holding his breathing tube. If too much air gets into the suit, Michel will rise helplessly to the surface. Too little, and he'll lose consciousness. He has to regulate it himself while he works, using a valve at the back of his helmet. Michel can only see straight in front of him. He has to do everything by his sense of touch. It all makes Michel's admiration for his predecessors grow.
It's so difficult to move. Maybe it's easier when you get used to it, but I found it very hard. You have a narrow angle of vision, so you can't estimate the size of anything. You can't see what you're doing. And if you're also stirring up mud with your boots, it must have been terrible to try to work like that.
July 1908. Melin's divers raise columns, capitals, and works of art from the seabed. Now, Alfred needs time to examine his finds. Louis Poisson, an expert in preservation, arrives from Paris. Almost at once, he makes an important discovery: fragments of ancient timber. At last, Melin knows the truth. The wood is from the deck or hull of a ship. Medea is the site of an ancient shipwreck. Now the priority is to preserve the objects. From the minute they're exposed to oxygen, the surface of the finds deteriorate at an alarming rate. Sponges and pittocks are eating into the marble. Therefore, the figures are carefully cleaned. But if these works of art aren't from Atlantis, where do they come from? And where were they going? Melin suddenly remembers a letter written by the orator Cicero. Like most rich Romans, he loved to show off his collection of Greek art. He wrote to a friend in Athens, "I'm so looking forward to your Hermas with the bronze heads. Send them to me." All the evidence points to Athens as the port where the ship loaded its cargo. There's the Greek inscription on the Herma, and the other pieces are indisputably of Greek origin. Poisson agrees. What they have before them must be the relics of a flourishing trade in artworks. From Greece. But where to? Melin can only guess that the destination for the artworks must have been close by, in North Africa. Another wreck, discovered in a distant corner of the Mediterranean, might help clear up the puzzle. Off the Turkish coast at Kizilburun, archaeologist Deborah Carlson is researching a sunken ship.
Sending a buoy to the surface.
She knows Melin's pioneering work. She soon noticed parallels with her finds in Kizilburun. They date from the same period. Carlson's wreck wasn't carrying works of art, just stone columns, weighing up to 6 tons each. How did the Romans build vessels to carry such colossal cargoes, and how did they load them on board? Deborah Carlson can only speculate.
For me, it's still something of a puzzle to think about how these enormous pieces of marble would have been lowered into the ship's hold. Certainly they could not have sat on deck, I mean, with a weight of some 70 tons. But to be lowered into the hold, and they're just literally centimeters apart from one another. It must have been a really technological masterpiece.
Just like Alfred Melin, Deborah is trying to work out where the columns came from and where they were headed. The most useful evidence are the amphorae, or rather, not the pots themselves, but their contents. Traces of wine, oil, and grain show that this ship had sailed around the entire eastern Mediterranean. Archaeologists have now found evidence of a vast maritime trade network that kept the Roman Empire supplied with food and with luxuries. Deborah Carlson's divers want to find out where their ship departed from on its last voyage, and who was waiting in vain for its cargo of columns. She's developed a plan every bit as daring as Melin's was a century ago. Deborah plans to use lifting balloons to raise the giant stone blocks. Underneath, she hopes she'll find the remains of timbers, just as Melin did, that will tell her what sort of ship this was and where it came from. But the ropes can't take the enormous weight. One of the belts is about to slide off. Time to abort. The same problem Melin faced 100 years ago. Alfred Melin needs money from Paris, but the authorities are unconvinced. He meets a French official in Tunis. It is spring 1913. Paris has decided to cancel the next expedition to Mahdia. The situation in Europe is too tense. All available funds are going to rearmament. Melin and Poisson visit Tunisia's general resident, but he can only express his regrets. Melin's scientific achievements at Mahdia have been extraordinary, even sensational. But the high command of the French Mediterranean Fleet has ruled against any civilian offshore activities for the time being. Even appeals to the National Academy of Science have come to nothing. Melin is stuck. Deborah Carlson understands the pressure on archaeologists to get results, especially when her high-tech equipment costs so much to hire and run. Right now, she has one final chance to raise the columns. If it goes wrong this time, her expedition will have failed. Tons of marble float free and rise to the surface. Deborah only needs one block. In Melin's time, the idea was to salvage as much as you could. Today, things are different. Use the minimum to reconstruct the culture. Underneath the resting place of the columns, they find the hoped-for wood samples. timbers that once formed the ship's skeleton. Conserved by mud on the sea floor.
I'm astonished, but the wood is really in very good condition, and it's thrilling in a way to be able to touch the inside of a ship that was built 2,000 years ago.
This ship was built of top-quality pine wood, like many Roman merchant ships. By putting together finds from all over the Mediterranean, a typical cargo ship can be reconstructed. Big hatches allowed bulky loads to be stowed deep in the ship's holds. That, in turn, gave the low center of gravity needed for stability. But in spite of this expertise, the ships at Mahdia and Kizilburun still capsized. Why? Deborah Carlson believes the vessels were grossly overloaded. They were easy prey to the wind and the waves. The size and shape of the columns remind Deborah of the temples of the Oracle of Claros on the Turkish coast. She wonders if this was their destination. In the ancient world, it was just as famous as its counterpart at Delphi. Pilgrims came here to pray to Apollo. This place has always been famous for its gigantic columns, and it's only 50 kilometers from the wreck at Kizilburun.
Here at Claros, we're seeing that the column drums of the Apollo temple are in fact proportionally very similar to the column drums from Kizilburun. So we're very excited that I think we have a very good match.
The grooves running vertically up the columns are especially characteristic of the remains at Claros. And the interesting thing about the grooves is that they were only carved after the columns arrived here. Here's a section of column that hasn't yet been carved. It still has the same protective sheath found on the columns salvaged from the sea. This block is almost identical with the marble from the Kizilburun wreck. Deborah is sure that her cargo was intended for the Oracle at Claros.
It's incredible. We have the three phases from the newly quarried drums at Kizilburun, the finished drums here at Claros, and now also at Claros, this intermediate stage. Yes, exactly. It's tremendous. I mean, you don't always find evidence like this. It's so special. It really is. It's very exciting.
Now it's clear. This heavily laden ship set out from the island of Marmara. Its captain chose a route along the coast and came to grief in a Mediterranean storm. But that doesn't explain why Merlin's wreck sank off the Tunisian coast. To solve this last riddle, Michel Loue has gone to Tunisia. At the National Museum, he meets Taher Gahalia, keeper of the priceless artworks from Mahdia. Loue hopes they will provide clues to the departure point and the destination of the ship, just as Deborah Carlson's columns helped her.
There are certainly many links between the Mahdia wreck and the one at Kizilburun off the Turkish coast that the American team is investigating. The cargoes are very similar. They were both transporting columns, capitals, and heavy works of art, doubtless because that was the cheapest and most effective way to transport heavy loads.
Now he has seen all the artworks from Mahdia, Michel realizes just how closely the two wrecks are connected. A study of the marble has revealed it definitely comes from a quarry in Greece, just like the marble from Kizilburun. And that could fit another of Merlin's theories. He believed this cargo could have been plundered in wartime. In the year 86 BC, the Roman general Sulla had conquered and sacked Athens. Could the treasures be booty from that event? But here, Michel Loua rejects his predecessor's idea.
On pense plutôt à des productions standardisées, mais plus du tout à l'idée de ce pillage d'Athènes.
We tend to believe that these articles were made to order, produced especially for export, not that they were plundered from Athens. They could have been meant for a temple or for the villa of a rich landowner. One thing is sure, they are signs of a life of considerable luxury.
Alfred Merlin was never sure where his ship was sailing to when it sank 3 nautical miles off Medea, but he had always been certain it set out from Athens. Now, the latest research suggests that Rome, not North Africa, was its destination. Only Rome had collectors who could afford this cargo. Something drove the ship off course. Most likely it was caught in the Scirocco, blowing at hurricane speeds from the Sahara. Loua believes that's how the disaster began. Wind and currents drove the ship ever closer to the coast. As it pitched and yawed, the mast broke. The heavy cargo slipped until the ship disappeared beneath the waves. For 2,000 years its cargo lay on the seabed, until Alfred Merlin brought it to the surface. Now he's out of money. Only a spectacular new success will squeeze more funds out of Paris. But Merlin and Poisson are only too aware they desperately need a kindred soul, prepared, as they are, to stake everything on one final throw. The only man who can help them is Captain Yorgos Zourdos. Unless he's prepared to send his divers down for one last campaign, Merlin and Poisson will, in effect, be unemployed. Merlin has no way of knowing there's anything still to be found down there, but he's committed his last reserves of money. The two of them may not have hit it off instantly when they embarked on their first endeavor 5 years ago, but Merlin now knows that he can have absolute trust in the old sea dog's expertise, as well as in the skill and courage of his divers. Captain Zourdos, for his part, has come to respect the Frenchman's tenacity, and he's impressed by the urgency of the appeal. He's in. That same evening they set out to sea. Merlin is convinced that every minute counts if he's to persuade his masters in Paris before the political situation worsens. Captain Zourdos and his crew even agree to dive by night. The fewer people who know about this expedition, the better. The atmosphere on the bridge is tense as the divers prepare. Night diving is almost unheard of. It's only possible with an underwater lamp developed for working in muddy waters. The light it throws is so feeble that the divers have to sift the seabed centimeter by centimeter with their fingers. "3 years have passed since their last dive. Zourdos is sure he has brought them back to the same place. But there's no trace of any remains. With every unsuccessful dive, Merlin's morale plummets. If only he could join the divers on the sea floor. And then they discover what even Merlin hardly dared hope for, a remarkable find 40 meters down. The bronze statue of the Greek god Eros. It almost seems like divine intervention. Merlin has gambled everything on one card, and he has pulled it off again. Now Paris can't brush him off. Found wonderful statue. Would appreciate funds to continue work. Perhaps 5,000 francs? Respectfully yours, Merlin. The answer comes just a few days later. His greatest triumph turns into his bitterest defeat. Paris has turned him down. It's the end of a long journey for Alfred Merlin. The young excavator of Carthage had become the celebrated discoverer of the artworks of Medea. But today, all that achievement dissolved in disappointment. A century later, Merlin's underwater treasures still count as some of the greatest discoveries of underwater archaeology. For Michel Loua, France's chief archaeological diver, they are still the yardstick by which all other finds can be assessed, and so they form the basis for ever new discoveries. This discipline is always changing. Things that seem certain today can appear in a very different light tomorrow. No one knows that better than Michel Loua. He acknowledges his debt to Merlin. No other wreck has ever given up so many works of art.
You could say that an entirely new discipline was invented right here. That's really moving. 2,000 years ago, a ship disappeared here. 100 years ago, the sponge divers found it. And in the mid-20th century, a new science was born. That's wonderful.
After the First World War, 7 years after his last spectacular find in Medea, Alfred Merlin returns triumphantly to Paris. He becomes director of the Department of Greek and Roman Antiquities at the Louvre. But his passion remains the treasure from Medea. The first excavation at the bottom of the sea. And every time the lights dim and the pictures start telling their story, audiences are thrilled by the first daring excursion into history underwater. An excursion into a sunken world that had been unreachable for more than 2,000 years. An article of faith and a unique collaboration between scientists and laymen. The wreck at Medea is still considered one of the greatest achievements of archaeology, both for the quality of the finds and for the way it opened a new approach to the ancient world. Alfred Mélin died in Paris in 1965. By that time, countless people had followed his lead into the depths, even though he never dived himself. Today, some of the Medea marble columns still lie on the seabed, until someone comes along and proves they are, after all, the remains of Atlantis. They remain the monument in stone to one of the greatest men to have inquired into ancient civilizations.